Now we know a little bit more about the draft 20-year state infrastructure strategy, but I think there's more to find out in this panel discussion. So I'm joined here today by Phil Hellberg, the CEO, John Langelant, the Chair, Nicole Lockwood, who is the Deputy Chair, and Lance Blair, the CEO of Infrastructure WA. And we're just going to have a discussion, but first of all, I'm curious to find out, how do you feel? You must have had this date on your mind for so long. John, what about you?
Full of anticipation, really. When you develop these sort of documents, there's nothing like getting them out there and then getting the feedback, because that's what we do it for.
Yeah.
And we've got a fabulous crowd here today who you can start writing tomorrow, guys.
Oh, boy. No, we're going to take it right up to that September 15 deadline, I think. Nicole, what about you? You've been on an infrastructure planning journey for a few years now.
Yeah, look, just really proud. I think having done this exercise twice at a national level and knowing how complex it can be. When we started this 2 years ago and we knew we had all the infrastructure components to look at and all the state agency work, it was a real challenge, and I was really curious to see how we were going to go and to come out with a document that's at the level of granularity and the level of sophistication that the team's created. I'm just so proud of them all.
And Lance, it was your team. You must be proud of them.
Very proud of the team and thank them for all of their great work. It really is the culmination of just a lot of work that's come in, but really I just feel privileged that we can actually have this gathering today with so many people in one room, so it's a fantastic opportunity. Certainly,
we're very fortunate. And Phil, I heard a rumour that you've chosen to renovate your garage while putting this together. How's that been?
Yeah, not good timing. As my wife in the audience will probably tell me, you really didn't pick a good time. Finding tradies and being busy at work. So no, it's been an awesome experience. Like everyone, very proud of the team, and as a true project manager, I guess very proud that we've actually done it on time. Yeah. Despite all the curveballs, despite COVID and everything else, really getting it done on time for me is a big tick.
Yeah. Well done. Let's hope the garage ends up the same way. So, John, my first question is for you. Many people here will want to know what the draft strategy says about the new pipeline of major infrastructure projects and programs for WA, roads, railways, hospitals and the like. What can you tell us? Is there anything new?
Thanks, Sandra. As we've said in the prepared presentations, there's a lot in this document which is about looking after what we already have. We've got a big infrastructure base across the state, and we've spent a lot of time looking at it and saying, how can we ensure that we maintain that infrastructure base so it serves the needs of the community, and we don't just think about building something new. So that's one really important point to note, and you'll see that as you read the document. But you'll also pick up through this document, through the 88 recommendations, you're going to pick up 60 specific projects and programs that we're recommending either for development or for further business cases to be undertaken or for investigations to be undertaken. So it's quite rich. And you also need to think about this over a long period of time. This isn't just over the next couple of years. We're talking about those 60 programs stretching out over the full 20 years. So there's a long period of time in which a good deal of this work needs to be done. And it's across all of the key areas of infrastructure. You can rattle them off, but all of the likely suspects are there. Health, the transport, the education, and then into tourism, so important for the diversification of the state. Ensuring that the essentials of life are looked after. We can develop infrastructure strategies as long as we like, but we need to make sure there's enough water available to all of our communities. And we talk a lot about that through this document, and there are significant specific infrastructure suggestions in the document. There's a lot about planning. There's a lot about urban planning through this document. The other really important part about the answer to your question also is, once we finalise the strategy, and in doing so, in this draft strategy, you as the community gave us over 2,000 ideas of specific built form infrastructure. So we whittled that back quite a bit. We're going to get another set of recommendations as to what else could be built now. And then the final strategy, once the government considers that final strategy, comes to a view on it, then the next step in this process is to develop what we call a 10-year state asset plan. And that's the government's plan. And that then, I think, starts really defining the programs and projects. That happens in 23-24. So again, good time to digest this, good time to work it through and to think carefully about just what those projects will be.
Okay, well, we'll certainly be interested to look at the urban planning recommendations in the document, John. Nicole, long-term infrastructure strategy is notoriously difficult, but long overdue. None of us have a crystal ball. It's very hard to guess what might happen next week at the moment. How have you dealt with that uncertainty in the strategy?
Well, Sandra, the timing of this was really interesting. Obviously, we were just getting moving and then COVID really came upon us. We had intended to take the opportunity and look at sort of scenario planning. So we're all very aware that, you know, the movement of the world is too rapid to be able to anticipate anything in a meaningful way without thinking of alternative futures. So you'll see in the back end of the document there was some detailed scenario work done around these different type of outcomes. So looking at geopolitical issues, looking at environmental outcomes, looking at different social trends. And we did that to make sure that anything we came up with at the end could be sensitised against that. So was it still going to stack up if those different futures eventuated? As part of this, obviously, we were looking at long-term population forecasting, other types of data. But as we all know now, all of that becomes difficult to understand with what we've just experienced. So I think what was really helpful in the process was having COVID in the same time frame made us really question what's a sort of not business as usual, but what are the non-negotiables? Okay, so we're all going to be here in some form. We want to live in a more resilient way. We want a better outcome for our communities, and they're the things we really held on to. And that's really where some of our opportunities have landed, and certainly where the themes have emerged from. The benefit of the process that we've done and the legislation is that this is an iterative exercise. So this strategy is a 20-year strategy, but it has a 5-year refresh process. So it gives us the chance to keep coming back and checking whether the assumptions we made were correct. We also have a monitoring and evaluation function as part of our work. So as the government rolls this out, we can start to monitor how that implementation is going. And if big changes happen, there's an opportunity to come back and refresh those. So I think what the benefit of what we've done is that this really being a foundational document is about the no-regret steps we must take to be able to position ourselves well. As John's pointed out, some of the build options are things that are, a lot of them are not new. These are things that people have been talking about for a long time. What we want agencies now to do is go back and look at some of their other planning and think in the light of some of the challenges we've put before them and rethink some of the opportunities that they've been pursuing. So that this framework allows us that flexibility over time to keep iterating as we go.
Great. Yeah, well, we have plenty of agency representation here in the room. I'm sure they will look forward to getting stuck into reading the strategy. Lance, COVID-19 has really changed the game when it comes to things like working from home, borders and quarantining. How have you dealt with this in the draft strategy over both, like, really the immediate short term, but then the medium and long term?
Yeah, thanks, Sandra. It has been certainly an interesting time to do an exercise like a 20-year strategy, and as Nicole was saying, when it's so hard really just to see what the short term is looking like. So we've had to make some assumptions, certainly, through that, and we've seen a lot of the impacts of COVID playing out in the state, around the country, and globally as well. I think it's been a timely reminder just to show us how quickly things like demand for infrastructure can change, both upwards and downwards. We've seen impacts in things like increasing road freight demand, obviously a decrease in demand for aviation very significantly, increase in telecommunications, decrease in public transport patronage, more people using the roads. Those types of things, but really when it comes down to it, it probably is, when you're talking sort of long term, probably too early to tell really exactly what the long lasting effects of COVID will be for infrastructure. But as I said, we have made some assumptions around that. We've assumed a return to population growth sooner rather than later, and so on. What I would add to that, though, is that it's not just all doom and gloom in terms of the considerations of COVID that we've thought through. And if I can just give you a quick example of that, things like telehealth and the use of telehealth, which is a fantastic service. I've used it myself a few times and it's very good. In the early days of COVID, we saw use of telehealth triple. And that has dropped back. It's down to about 160, 170% above what it was pre-COVID. So that obviously helps with demand on those services and with the service delivery. So they're the sorts of things, I suppose, that we're trying to embrace and see continued beyond this time. So really, we've mostly focused in the medium and long term. And a lot of the work that government is doing through the recovery plan is focusing much more on that short term.
Yeah. Okay, good. All right. Now, I've got a question for all of you. The strategy does cover a lot of ground here. There's 88 recommendations, 200 sub-recommendations, and 16 different chapters. So I want to ask each of you, if you had to pick one recommendation, which would it be and why? I think we'll start with you, Phil, and hear from everyone.
Thanks, Sandra. Yes, look, I'm probably giving away a bit of my engineering background with my answer, but I guess for me it's in the immense opportunity that exists within digital technologies at the moment. You just look at how it's changing the world and how rapidly it's doing that, and you're just left absolutely amazed. The strategy, as I mentioned earlier, the strategy recommends two things in that space. One is for us to take a digital-first approach, and what we mean by that is that throughout the life of an asset, to continuously ask us the question, is there a digital answer to our problem that we're trying to solve? Because new ones are appearing every day. And the second one is how we use the information that we already have, the data. It's extremely powerful, and we can do so much with it. And there's a treasure chest of unlocked potential there that we just need to realise. You know, our resource sector are doing it fantastically well. We are world leading in that space. When you think about remote operations, automation, etc., we need to diversify that across all our industries. We need to build that capacity, not only within those industries, but also within the public sector. And I think when you just think about, again, when you operate an asset, you know, how do you optimise that? We're doing it already. There's the Kwinana Freeway. There's an example where we're using technology to avoid having to add another lane. We should just do more of that.
Yeah.
You know, in the planning, using that information then to help us plan. Our job will be a lot easier if we have good information and good data. And then lastly, in the construction process, you know, I think everyone says the construction industry suffers from a productivity issue. There's an answer for you. You know, let's look at technology and how we can use that to improve productivity in the construction industry.
Okay, that's an interesting challenge. John, what about you?
Well, I'm struggling to limit it to one, Sandra, so I'll just be really quick on one, and that is, I think one of the great things in this document is we call out across all of the agencies and the trading enterprises in WA the importance of the strategic asset plans, which we ask all agencies to do every year. That provides the foundation work for good infrastructure planning over the medium term, supported by good business cases, and I would say that, wouldn't I? But I think good business cases are critically important. But if I look across what we did, there are so many things here. I'd call out the regions, I think. I mean, the work we've done in regional infrastructure thinking is really important. I mean, the regions are... There's 10 regions in WA. We keep forgetting that there's 10. 9 of them sit outside the Perth region. They contribute 40% of gross state product. They have 25% of our population. They all have real strengths. And we've gone through and studied what those strengths are. And we've called out key infrastructure requirements that will assist those regions continue to develop. We've also identified things which we think are critically important for all the regions to do well. Pick up Phil's point, digital connectivity, key one. Another one is how do we provide infrastructure which diversifies their economic base? And the third I'd call out is how do we provide infrastructure in the regions which improves the quality of living for the people who are in the regions. And the Indigenous community are just critically important in that regard. And we've got a lot of discussion and significant recommendations around how do we enhance the livability of regional areas, including for the Indigenous community.
Thank you. Nicole, what about yours? Might it be a Ports one? Or?
No, it's not a Ports one. For me, this is the real gift, I think, of this document is it's a truly strategic look at the whole system. So it's the first time we've been able to understand the system as a whole. What I'm really excited about is the fact that we've tried to portray the picture of investment at the start of the continuum. So, for example, in housing, and what that does with the assistance of the right intervention early in health and education to stop impacts later down the line. So when you look at that investment profile, how we intervene, and we've used some examples. So there was one given to us in the mental health and education space around multisystemic therapy. So if you intervene in a family early when a child is struggling, a very small investment at that point, what that means for the long term of hospitals and prisons, for example. So this issue of demand management actually comes back to infrastructure is an enabler of our lifestyle and our well-being. Infrastructure is not an end in itself. And we thought about what we want for West Australians is actually a place where they thrive. And actually building more of the things at the end of the continuum, like hospitals and prisons, isn't the answer. It's actually going back to the preventative end of the system. And it equally applies in some of the hard infrastructure areas like water and transport. And we watched through COVID how quickly our behaviour could change if outside influences meant that that was required. That means a huge difference in the profile of what we need in terms of built form. Similarly in water, we call out the need to understand how our sources are being used and for what purpose, so that we can start to make informed decisions about how we're using the precious resources we have. So what we've tried to do is not just pick off individual things, we've tried to understand where intervention is needed to totally change the system.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. And Lance, a favourite recommendation?
Look, for me, I think it's a focus around getting greater urban consolidation, particularly here in Perth. There's quite a lot in the strategy that aims to support that. What we know is Perth's targets compared to other cities, major cities around the country, are fairly low, but we do struggle to even meet those quite a lot. So the strategy's got quite a significant focus around this. There is some really good things being done, just to recognise that. Things like Design WA, planning reform, planning around train station precincts and those types of things. But this is really important from an infrastructure point of view. Depending on which study you read, the cost to service a greenfield lot versus an infill one is around 2 to 4 times greater for greenfield. And if you add that up over the next few decades, you run into the billions of dollars. So it's a serious issue from an infrastructure point of view. And it really does, consistent with our themes, it really makes a lot of sense to make better use out of the infrastructure we've already got, the schools, the roads, and so on. Just to point out, we're not pitting here infill against greenfield. It's not that one is good and one is bad. They both have a role to play. Where we're coming from is we think the balance needs to tip much stronger towards infill development, and that's where we're coming from to build a smarter city for the future. So I suppose just touching on a few of the recommendations we've got around this, Phil I think had one in his slide deck earlier around an urban consolidation action plan. That would identify the key barriers and set out a roadmap for addressing them. Things like the policy settings, things like developer or development incentives and purchaser incentives. And then we've got a range of other recommendations in the strategy that will also support or go towards supporting greater infill. So things like light rail and bus rapid transit for Perth's inner and middle suburbs, things like increasing the use of vertical schools in appropriate locations, and a city opportunity plan for the Perth CBD and the immediate surrounds.
Okay, well, I'm sure I will be skipping to that chapter, Lance. I think for members of the Property Council will be very interested to hear about ways that we can improve the government's policy and regulatory frameworks to deliver more effective infill housing development. Now, wouldn't be doing my job today unless I asked you a question that was a bit tricky. One of WA's biggest ever public infrastructure proposals, Westport. Phil, I'll give you the hard one. Do you have anything to say about Westport and perhaps also Row 8 and Row 9?
Yes, Sandra, look, I think the first thing I'd say is that the strategy supports, in principle, a Westport.
Right.
I think, we've looked at the planning that was done and all the work that was done to support where we are today, and we think it's good work that's being done, and we fully support that. You look all over the world where port cities are faced with similar issues around growth and capacity, and in many instances they've turned it into absolute fantastic opportunities, redevelopment opportunities for the old ports. And I think this is an opportunity on our doorstep. So for us, it's not so much about whether it should happen, it's more about when.
Okay.
So what the strategy does recommend is let's look at the timing. Let's look at answering the questions that we still have, which is how much freight stays at Fremantle? What type of freight stays at Fremantle? And then what the master plan, what the vision looks like for Fremantle. And then we can, decide when that needs to occur, but also what will the transport network look like that would service the inner harbour. And that'll include freight and non-freight. So to your question about Row 8 and Row 9, our view is that it's premature to even have that discussion. We need to think about when it's happening, what the future of Fremantle looks like, and then we can work out what transport network we need to service that new area. Okay,
all right, thank you. I think we've almost run our time, so I'll have to ask you a last question that perhaps all of you can answer. I'm not quite sure if we'd like to use another few minutes, but anyway, we'll get on with this one. Perhaps, Phil, if I sneak in one more for you. We're renowned for a cyclical economy. We have our programs that are often infrastructure programs that can be overheated with government delivering at the same time as the private sector. We saw it during the last resources boom, and to some extent we're seeing that again now. Is there anything in the strategy that's going to deal with this perennial issue?
Look, it is a challenge. It's something we faced during the resources boom. It's something we're facing again now. I can't say that there's a silver bullet in the strategy as to how we should fix this. Clearly the intent is for government to try and create a counter-cyclical way of investing in infrastructure so that we don't have that, occurring at the same time. Public infrastructures in WA still only makes out about 10% of overall investment in infrastructure. So, what's happening in the resource industry and the private sector is huge. And throwing the government component in just makes it even more complex. I guess two things the strategy does offer, though. One is around, as John mentioned, the infrastructure, just in the process of having a 10-year infrastructure program will give industry better visibility of what that pipeline looks like over a 10-year period. So industry can plan better for this.
Yeah, definitely.
Obviously, we can't cater for the unknowns, a COVID or something like that, but at least it gives us more visibility. And the second thing is, when we do our planning, we need to think about this up front. Think about capacity within the public sector to deliver, think about capacity within industry, and do that across agencies so that we can take a portfolio approach to this and really see whether we should smooth out the investment cycle, especially in the regions where we have real capacity constraints currently. Look at which agencies are planning to do work in the regions, how can we better coordinate and smooth that process out.
Okay. Well, that is a very good point to conclude on, I think, Phil. Thank you. Thank you. Congratulations to you all on this very important day. I can see the waiting media are very keen to get hold of you, so we'll let you go. Can we please thank our panel today? Thank you.